Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Immunity Blueprints Summit. I'm thrilled to introduce our next guest, Dr. Michael Fleischer. Dr. Fleischer is a holistic chiropractic physician and a whole foods nutritionist and an expert in adaptogens. So welcome, Dr. Mike. How are you?
I'm excellent. I'm
Good.
excellent. Thanks so much for having me today.
It's great to have you here. Can you please explain a little bit more about yourself and how you got interested in this holistic approach to wellness?
You want the long story or the short story?
Whatever you want.
No, I'll keep it slimmed down. Well, almost 40 years ago, it started with observing my father's and my grandfather's health, which wasn't very good. They became sicker and sicker through time, and they were dependent on pharmaceuticals for life sustenance. And I recognized that their entire chemistry became dependent on these pharmaceuticals. It didn't make any sense whatsoever to me. I began to call into question the choices I needed to make in my lifetime with regard to personal self-care and responsibility for my own health. And I didn't want to see myself nor my children become dependent on drugs. And so that's kind of how it all began. I'm a chiropractor, as you mentioned earlier. I've focused on many healing modalities over time. I will have to say that nutrition, herbal medicine, metabolic function, all of those were focuses for me as I grew to know myself and what I wanted to learn in and through my healing process. So it began there. I believe that we heal through our learning, or let's put it this way, we learn through our healing, and then we heal through our learning. This is a really important thing to keep in mind as you expand and open yourself up to possibilities that are outside the range of the typical, medical model, or what I often refer to as disease care. I think the medical model is completely relevant, of course. I'm more organic in nature, meaning I lean towards the alternative side of healing myself and advising my community on how they can heal themselves. But I think it's really important to understand how we do, in fact, we heal from our learning and we learn from our healing. It's something I really like to say. Then in the late 70s, I owned a 5-acre farm where I grew all my own organic produce. And at that time, I was actually observing my grandfather, who was dying of emphysema and suffered for almost 20 years. And then later, maybe 10 or 15 years later, observed my father and what was happening with his chronic heart disease. So growing my own organic produce, I used it for myself. I opened a vegan restaurant at the time, which was in the 70s, by the way. So it was even before a person even knew. I don't know for sure that there was a definition for vegan, but we clearly defined vegan in our restaurant because we found out how it wasn't all that popular to eat that way. We were, of course, 1 mile from the campus that we had all graduated. 2 of my peers and myself had just finished undergraduate school, and we were entrepreneurs, apparently. We opened our restaurant as our first entrepreneurial venture together. And there was a great focus in the community on eating organic and doing better and alternative energy and all those things that were important to all of us on campus at Stockton State College, which was a newly defined, newly opened school. And it was graduating a lot of us who were actually thinking outside of the box. So it graduated through time from the 70s and from that incredible restaurant called Down to the Carrot, by the way, which was an organic, it was a George O'Mahony is what I wanted to say. It's a George O'Mahony stainless steel diner, one of those classic bus-like looking stainless steel diners typically used by truck drivers. And it took us a good month to clean the grease off the walls, but we finally got it to...
You were a pioneer of the food truck era.
Yeah, you might say that. It looked like a food truck. I wish I had a picture to share with everyone. It's quite brilliant, actually. We had one of my friends paint a large mural above the stainless steel diner. It was incredibly large, and down to the carrot with 3 dancing vegetables dancing out of a pan into someone's mouth. So it's quite brilliant and quite kind of whatever. It definitely made some waves in our community, and in fact, many of the truck drivers were converted. They were eating soy burgers and repeating and coming back as repeat business. It was a brilliant way to, gently introduce all options. So that was a period of my life. That was for about 5 years, and then in the late 80s, to jump forward just a bit in time, I decided I would begin taking my pre-med courses. And eventually I ended up at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, and eventually needed to make a choice between whether I would become an osteopath or a chiropractor. And at that time, the orientation was shifting for osteopaths, meaning the requirement for becoming an osteopath, for becoming an MD, was that we needed to study pharmaceuticals. And that was completely contrary and incongruent with the lifestyle I had been living, with the observations I had made about my father and grandfather. And ultimately, I decided, no way. I was going to deliver whatever I could as a healing modality with my hands to facilitate a process for people from which they could heal themselves. Understanding a basic tenet in chiropractic was that, in fact, the power that created us is the power that can heal us. So that's where it all began, Lynn. Emily, it was kind of organic in nature, and it was a process through time and a journey like we all go through. But here I am now speaking with all of you, and hopefully to thousands of others that will hear what we have to say here. I understand that there are a number of other contributors, I'm very sure, that will provide powerful information that can act as springboards for everyone to make a choice about their own self-care, about their own personal responsibility for their health. And then we can actually redefine what health care is as different from disease care, which is also equally important, of course, in acute circumstances. So I'll kind of leave it at that for right now.
It sounds like quite a journey. But I also understand that you spent some time in the rainforest. And I would like to know if that was when you were introduced to adaptogens, or if you were using them before. But actually, before you explain or tell us about, your time in the rainforest, can you explain what adaptogens are?
Adaptogens, yes, and I'd be happy to share those stories. There's multiples of those stories. I love the rainforest, and I love the plant kingdom. I've always loved the plant kingdom. In the plant kingdom, there are approximately 40 or more specific plants that would be considered and defined as adaptogens. And adaptogens have the ability, because of where they live and how they're typically uncultivated, so based on their environment, they actually function that same way as a mirror inside the body. I can talk more about that in just a minute. I can give you an example of that. But adaptogens have this capacity to support the self-regulating mechanisms of our body. So given that tenet that I earlier described, the fact that the power that heals us is the power that created us is the power that heals us, this group of plants does exactly that. They were placed on this planet with very specific purpose. And that purpose, when entering into the body, when consumed, is to support the innate regulating mechanisms that exist. And without them, we would be in real trouble. That's what happens when we go haywire. We get so far outside of homeostasis that the body begins unbalancing itself or dysregulating, and many of those innate mechanisms are then disrupted, and we move into a dis-ease state. So if you take that word apart, disease, dis-ease, it's really a definition of what happens to the body when we move away from homeostasis or self-regulation, systems self-regulating. And then we become in or enter into a state of dis-ease, or as commonly pronounced, disease. So the rainforest is a brilliant place. It's just a brilliant place. The shamans and the native tribes, of course, learned by their own doings, their own medicine. And there are many stories about how that was done. Very often in altered states, the shamans would recognize the plants that had healing qualities. That's certainly a story that's out there. I believe that that's probably a strong possibility. And then the second possibility, of course, is as science learned that there were these incredible healing plants that could do these remarkable things in the body, every pharmaceutical company in the world traveled to the rainforest, is the truth. The only difference is they didn't use the whole plants. They took the whole plants, recognizing there were qualities of those plants that might be able to be investigated. And as science does so well, they brought them to the laboratories and they were investigated. And typically they're fragmented and they're isolated. So parts of the plant, they would identify the molecules, which they thought were so effective in bringing that specific benefit to the human body. But what, in my opinion, of course, it's my opinion, they fail to recognize is that it's the whole plant and the synergy of all of the phytonutrients that exist within that whole plant. Whole plant nutrition, whole food nutrition is where I like to focus. They fail, in my opinion, to recognize the inherent qualities of that synergy, that potential that exists when all these phytonutrients are harmonizing, amplifying, and potentiating their effect on the human body when they're consumed. So the rainforest is brilliant. The adaptogens is a family that grows in various kinds of rainforests, not just the Amazon. There are, as you know, there are rainforests in Siberia. There are rainforests in Eastern Europe. Brilliant forests. I've walked in those forests. Just beautiful forests. And these plants are harvested, sustainably harvested. They grow wild. They grow uncultivated. And the strength of their environment is represented in how they, or the effects that they can have on your body. They have very potent effects. And those effects, in a general category, again, are there to support the self-regulation of the body. So I hope that answered your question. I went off a bit there, but did that answer your question, Emily?
Yeah. You explained what adaptogens are, but when you spent time there, was that the first introduction you had to adaptogens, or had you studied them previously?
Great question. I would say that I'd studied them previously because at that time I was a corporate consultant to a company. That was a company that Amazon, John Easterling, as he was known, the gentleman who was married to Olivia Newton-John, had a company called the Amazon Herb Company. I began taking some of his products at the time. This was well over 20 years ago. And then recognized, wow, there's some real potency in this camu and this ipururu plant that was listed on the ingredient as one of the ingredients on some of these formulas. These formulas were spagirically extracted. Spagirically extracted implies that essentially the potency of the essence is maintained, and typically it can be just alcohol, it can be alcohol and water, it can just be water. It just depends on the formulator and how they decide to process or to extract, I should say. There's no processing, it's an extraction from the plant itself. So I would say I was taking some products, and then ultimately I was invited, I was sharing a lot of these products with a large group of people. And I decided, then they invited me actually to go to the rainforest. I traveled to the rainforest with Amazon, John Easterling, and then ultimately to Europe. And ultimately then I was representing the company to the ministries of health as I was seeking authorization for distribution of these formulas. And that was a 6-year sojourn because it's very complicated in Europe to get a formula, especially a complex formula, which would consist of more than one ingredient. One ingredient formulas are great, but when you put 6, 7, or 8, or 9 in a bottle, or in a formula, I should say, it gets much more complicated, especially with the European Union and the ministries of health. So it's quite a sojourn from the Amazon rainforest to Eastern Europe. I spent 6 years into the Czech Republic, and I traveled to England and to Germany and Austria, Italy, other places. And it was a great, fun journey. And at the end of it all, again, it was just a big learning process, and I'm so grateful for that, having had that opportunity.
You just took me to the rainforest in my head. I was imagining and envisioning all the trees, and it brought me back to this story that I know you shared, and I'd love for you to share this just because it's a beautiful example of the intelligence of these plants. The example of, I don't remember the specific plant itself, but it's the one that grows underwater during the monsoon.
Right.
Can you explain? It's a beautiful example of the intelligence.
Sure. As we all know, in the Amazon rainforest, particularly along the Ucayali River in the lower Amazon basin, there have monsoons. And there are times when the waters recede, of course, when away from the monsoon season. There's one tree called Ipo, I-P-O, Ruru, R-U. You kind of have to make like you're a Jetsons character, like the dog on Jetsons, if any of you remember that. But anyway, Ipo Ruru is a tree that actually sprouts. Well, it's seeded naturally along the banks of the Ucayali River, and then as the monsoons come, of course, water covers these seeds naturally. These are just naturally occurring circumstances, but the plants literally can sprout underwater. Now think about that. How can they sprout underwater? Typically oxygen is required. So what is it about this plant that has a mechanism that's so adaptable? Well, it is, and it was, and the Iparuru tree grows as the seed then sprouts and then begins to grow when the waters recede along the banks of the river. These trees literally begin to grow along the banks of the river. And when the monsoons again come, the tree's covered. I'm sorry, the tree is now above the water. Okay, at this point, I'm bringing you like a more mature tree now. And when it's above the water, what you see as you boat along the river, you'll see the circumambulation or the torrent of water spinning around the tree trunk. And I got to asking myself, well, that's interesting, because this tree, this leaf of the tree, I should say, the leaf of the tree, when you consume it, promotes circulation. It actually promotes recovery. So if you're within strenuous activity, for example, or recovering from strenuous activity, it will help you recover. I mean, instantly. So that circumambulation, again, I mentioned earlier, what happens in nature for these adaptogens very often mimics what the contribution they'll make inside your body, which is absolutely brilliant from my perspective. Just to me, that blew my mind, completely blew my mind. And I hope it blows yours, because it's a remarkable, when you think about that, that's completely remarkable. Here's another one, just for chuckles and giggles. I mean, we've got a sap, for example, that comes from a tree. The tree is called Sangre de Drago. The sap it's blood of the dragon. It's called Sangre de Drago. And I mean, it literally heals wounds. So if you just slightly, dice, I don't know what's the word, cut into the tree, then it begins to drip the sap. And if you take this sap and place it on an open wound, it will heal it almost instantly. Almost instantly. Why did they call it dragon's blood? I don't know exactly, but it looks like it's red when it leaks from the tree. As it drips down the trunk of the tree, you take a little bit of it. If you have a wound, it will heal it instantly.
Wow.
Yeah. It does the same inside the body. It has its own mechanisms where it supports the body. So there's so many plants like that in the rainforest. Sangre de Drago is not an adaptogen. Iparuru is not an adaptogen. I don't believe. I have to check that. But again, there are brilliant plants that grow inside the plant kingdom that have contributions to make, and all we need to do is get them available to us, and then of course responsibly and sustainably harvest those elements, those plants.
So can I just kind of want to deviate for just a second, because as you're talking, clearly these adaptogens in the plant world can support our immune system, but we've been seeing, especially recently, like people's immune systems, just especially with COVID, just kind of blow out. And can you explain what that mechanism is for how that people's immunity just blows out?
Well, you might call it, unfortunately, the pinnacle of what autoimmunity is, which is a complete disruption, dysregulation of the innate immune response in the human body, right? That's what is actually going on when COVID-19 enters the human body. It's a pandemic. We all know that. There are other pandemics, by the way. I might mention there's a pandemic for vitamin D, and there's not enough vitamin D. Research is telling us that most of us are carrying about 10 to 20 nanograms in our bloodstream when we should be carrying 40 to 60 nanograms in our bloodstream. And I'll detail a little bit about why vitamin D is so important for the human body, and recommend a very specific amount that everyone might consider taking for themselves. But back to your question, Lynn, regarding how the immunity blows itself out. Well, COVID is itself extremely virile. It's extremely dangerous, and when compared to other coronas in the line, they're finding out more and more about how much they don't know about COVID and about this particular pathogen. But it absolutely creates what they call a cytokinin storm, or shocked lungs is another way of looking at it. And that's why people die so rapidly within 5 days. They could be well, and then in 5 days have transitioned. And it's very sad. But this is the complete disruption of your innate immune response and your host defense mechanisms. They become in a state, or they move to a state of unbridled dysregulation. There's nothing that the body is able to come back to normal about. It's amazing how fast. It's so fast, and the body can deteriorate so fast with this pathogen. So, well, what do we do about it? That's the real question. And sure, there's this big emphasis on vaccines and where all that's going. I won't dig too deep into that, but only to say that there are natural mechanisms and systems that exist for us that can take care of us, but we have to take care of us. And that's where we fall short. There's a fundamental and foundational inadequacy, and how actually the entire world, I was going to say Americans, but the entire world has not learned yet what it takes to promote self-care. We've become so dependent on the medical model and disease care systems that we've forgotten our way. We've lost our way. And so back to your question, and I want to talk a little bit about vitamin D and how COVID actually disrupts one particular mechanism. There's a mechanism in the human body. I refer to it as the innate immune response, but that's a very general understanding. There are more specific mechanisms, very specific areas of the body that contribute to our immune regulation. And I want to highlight a few of those while answering your question here, Lynn. There's taking care of your gut. There's an entire science on the importance of taking care of the gut. Why? Because 80% of the immune system resides in the gut. And when you understand the human nervous system from a chiropractic point of view, I know that there's an enteric nerve that merges with the vagal nerve. It sends very specific messaging from our gut, our second brain, to the brain, our first brain. And there's hundreds of thousands of neuroreceptors, pathways for communication that begin in our gut and ultimately help us to self-regulate. So we might be able to touch on a few superfoods, for example. I'm a big proponent of specific superfoods that support the human body and the immune system in particular. There's adaptogens. And now let me talk about vitamin D. There are natural made antibiotics that are modulated by vitamin D. Vitamin D is not even necessarily just a nutrient. It's certainly defined as a nutrient, but it's as much a hormone, a genetic modulator, and an effective immune modulator. So when you supplement, you can be confident that your RAS system, which I'm going to just touch on, we're not going to get too deep in science here, but RAS is renin-angiotensin system. That renin-angiotensin system I'll describe very briefly, but vitamin D helps that function at its best. When it's deranged, when that system is deranged, it leads to what's called acute respiratory distress syndrome. Again, shocked lung. It's what happens when you have a cytokine storm. That means lots of infiltrates, inflammatory infiltrates. Your lungs are overwhelmed. You are unable to breathe. That's what I'm talking about, a cytokine storm. Okay? So that this RAS, this renin-angiotensin system, have to do with that acute respiratory distress syndrome? Well, keep in mind that renin is an enzyme. It regulates that cascade mechanism that helps us in the production of angiotensin 1 and 2. And so just think of angio 1 and angio 2. Angio 1 maintains blood pressure and fluids and salt balance in the body. Blood pressure, fluids, and salt balance in the body. Those are crucial elements to maintaining homeostasis. Okay. Well, what's angio 2? Angio 2 is inflammatory in nature. So when left to its own devices, it's super inflammatory, and it leads to what is called that cytokine storm that I talked about. And that produces again, the infiltrate in the lungs, all the inflammation. It shocks the heart and the kidneys. And that's why you're hearing about kidneys are shutting down. The lungs are particularly shutting down. So when there's a bad guy, there's always a good guy. Somewhere in the picture, there's a good guy. And this good guy is another enzyme that sits on every membrane of every cell. It's called angiotensin converting enzyme. So it converts angio, and it converts, what it ultimately does, it converts angio 2 to angio 1. Thus now we're moving back into regulation and optimal function. So think of it this way. This is, I'll paint the layman's picture because this is really, really important. COVID-19, it targets that enzyme on the cell membrane, that ACE2, that ACE2, okay? It's like a lock and key effect. The spike protein is the key, okay? And the ACE2 is rendered useless. It's like once that key enters that lock, that ACE2 is rendered useless. Well, why is that important? Well, if it's useless, it can't help regulate us. So thereby autoimmunity, thereby the switch goes on, the cytokine storm begins, and our lungs are overwhelmed and our entire body begins to deteriorate. It's very difficult for unhealthy people that are fundamentally unhealthy from the get-go with what they call comorbidity issues. It's very difficult for them to recover when that begins to happen, right? That would make sense. How could you recover if your health was already compromised going into or being exposed to this pathogen. So what does vitamin D do? Vitamin, basically, the way I look at it, if you have enough in your bloodstream, it's like it covers that spike. Think of blankets. I always like to paint simple pictures. You take a blanket, you cover the spike protein, that little corona, all those spikes that you see on those ugly floating circles on, in media that just are programming our minds into fear. Well, look, the spike protein can be covered. They're going to discover a lot more that I'm beginning to explain to you here, but this is just one mechanism I'm pointing towards in your body that can absolutely protect you and give you the greatest strength possible. Provide that invisible force field, taking care of your gut, making sure the adaptogens, which we'll probably talk a bit more in just a moment, are helping with self-regulation. Everything you can do, just simple things, not expensive things, simple things you can do to build that invisible force field. So I wanted to just mention that, Lynn, vitamin D and its relationship to immunity, and COVID's relationship to autoimmunity. When you talked about how it blows out the system, it absolutely does blow out the systems, and we don't want anyone to have to experience shock lung and the deterioration of their kidneys as a response to this virus. So I guess I'll stop there. Did that answer your question sufficiently?
Yeah, and in a way that I have not heard that kind of description before, and it was very clear, so I appreciate that.
Yep.
Now I have a question based on what you said. You alluded to it, how adaptogens can help us against viruses, and that was, kind of bringing us to homeostasis and keeping us at a good level. Can you explain a little more how adaptogens can be beneficial to us and supporting a strong immune system without, an overactive immune system?
Let's talk about the mechanism, or a mechanism. There are many, of course. Well, one that's particularly relevant to answering your question, Emily, okay? Cortisol is a hormone, a very powerful hormone, that the adrenal medulla, which sits on top of your kidneys like a little hat, spits into the bloodstream. And it does that naturally. In the early morning hours when you wake up, it immediately spits some cortisol into the system. It wakes the energy of the body up and can be extremely beneficial, of course, right? As the day rolls forward and we begin to function as a human body. When cortisol, however, is not regulated very well, when we feel fear, when we are in a sympathetic state of body, mind, sympathetic meaning everything is on high alert. We are really alarmed. There's a lot of cortisol that enters into the bloodstream, and that creates a lot of inflammation. And Emily, what do you know about inflammation when it's overall inflammation in our physiology?
If it's chronic, then it's harmful to us. And it does weaken the immune system because the body is just fighting it's overacting, I guess. Exactly.
Anytime there's overall inflammation in the body, let alone an acute inflammation like what happens with shocked lung during the COVID process, there's this, again, disruption, this dysregulation of the immune system. So if your gut isn't in good shape, and now you have all this cortisol spitting into the system, the gut is going to be even more disabled, right? As will other mechanisms in the body. So the adaptogens, of course, are supporting that innate immune response. Depending on the adaptogen, the individual adaptogen or group of adaptogens that you're consuming, you'll be able to regulate more or less different things. So let's just talk about, for example, how we regulate the cortisol. As you mentioned just a minute ago, if too much cortisol is always spitting into the bloodstream, you have a chronic condition. If we have something like COVID or another instance in which there's an acute inflammation that has other effects. So the adaptogens, again, the bottom line is that they will help regulate the response, whether it's too much or too little. So thereby, the root word adapt, it helps our body to adapt. If there's too much inflammation, too much cortisol, it will bring it down to normal levels, right? So if there's too little, it will bring it up to normal levels. That's the simplest way to understand the power of adaptogens. And
That's
it's subtle.
So
Go ahead.
So the same adaptogen will have, it brings you back to homeostasis for maybe not exactly technically, but no matter whether you've got too much of this going on or too little, it's gonna, that power of regulation, that's amazing.
It can. Exactly right. Exactly right. And of course, when they're co-extracted, it amplifies the effect of an individual plant and its benefits. It cancels any negatives from an individual plant. So that's the brilliance of formulators and formulation. And that's another discussion, of course.
No, actually, I just wrote it down. I wanted to ask you about that. So, because you alluded to it earlier, that you can take these individually, but there is kind of an amplification when certain plants or adaptogens are formulated together. So yeah, I want to understand that better if you could.
Again, to repeat what we just said, the integrity of the immune system is clearly dependent upon the reduction of overall inflammation in our body. Gut is a major place to re-answer that question, Emily. And very often that inflammation is mediated by cortisol. So I want to make that point. Now, Hans Selye, I think it was in 1907, discovered the hormone cortisol. And since then, thousands of papers on adaptogens and on the various mechanisms that they influence have been written. And everyone can do their own homework on the Google of everything, and they can find out as much as they want. Individual plants have their own capacities, some more or less, and very often in combination with each other are even more powerful. I also want to emphasize this idea of stress before I directly answer your question. This concept of stress that a lot of therapeutics do not consider or do not understand well enough. Therapeutics are designed to address stressors that have become, well, let's put it this way, they've blown out of proportion. And now you go to your chiropractor and you have lower back pain, for example. Or you go to your acupuncturist because your energy is all over the place and you just want to get yourself balanced again. You're recognizing that your physiology is unstable. And our physiology, obviously, and the mind-brain connection, mind-body connection is paramount for excellent health. So what therapeutics often fail to recognize is that stress must be addressed, because whether it's a chiropractor, a massage therapist, an acupuncturist, or any other healing modality, whether it's crystals to pharmaceuticals, really, no one is addressing stress first. So what we're powering through the stress to apply the therapeutic, thinking the stress will be managed by the therapeutic that's applied. I think quite opposite. And that's why adaptogens are so important, individually and collectively, to be consumed. Because let's reduce the stress first, so there's very many less layers to pound through when you apply your therapeutic. To me, that's intelligent. Address the stress first, adaptogens first, then apply whatever therapeutic is appropriate for that particular challenge. Adaptogens by themselves. Let's talk about Siberian ginseng, for example, probably one of the most commonly, most well-known. Eleuthero, is its name. It's also known as Siberian ginseng. It has a number of other names as well. It increases, the general benefit is that it increases capacity during strenuous exercise. So very powerful adaptogen for other reasons as well. A tremendous amount of phytonutrients in the form of bioflavonoids. Okay, I'm looking for a different word. It's not coming to me right now. But that particular plant by itself has tremendous potency. But when you add to it Rhodiola rosea, for example, you begin to suppress the production of cortisol. You protect your heart and your liver. You combat mental and physical fatigue. So as you combine certain specific plant adaptogens, you amplify what they're able to support within human physiology. I think I mentioned to you sometime we had spoken, I mentioned Schisandra chinensis. It's a tonic that nourishes the nervous system. So imagine for a moment, you're nourishing your nervous system, protecting your heart and your liver, you're combating mental and physical fatigue, you're suppressing excess production of cortisol. What if all that's happening together now because these plants have combined? Answering your question in particular, Lynn, right? So plants can be very powerful individually, but in my opinion, and not only my opinion, I work with the likes of Mark Premer. Mark Premer, he was involved with getting a handle on the Ebola virus when it first emerged and it first surfaced. We were very lucky with the Ebola virus because the Ebola virus didn't get to very large cities. It didn't become a pandemic, so to speak, and it didn't go into the large city states creating havoc like COVID is now. But he was instrumental in finding ways, developing protocols for that virus, for Ebola. And he is a formulator that has taught me the importance of synergy among plants, and then, of course, the potentiation that occurs. The amplification of these individual benefits are made possible when a formula has a gift and understands the science as well. It's not just intuitive, I should mention. There are chromatographical studies that actually are able to show you the various effects in bar graphs that tell you when there's synergy between two plants. So there is science to formulation. It's not purely a shamanistic intuition. It's a combination, of course. So I hope that answers your question, Lynn.
Yeah, it does. And you can use, excuse me, the whole plant in all cases, or in some cases, or some use just the root and some.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Yeah. With adaptogens, you're using all parts of the plant. It's absolutely brilliant. You can use the rhizome. The rhizome are not the tentacles, but they are actually the thicker roots that run parallel to the ground. So what you'll notice with certain adaptogens, like I'm trying to think of one right now. I think it's Rapondicum carthamoides. I'm not good at Latin, so don't quote me on that. But Rapondicum and the Siberian ginseng I was just talking about were often used by tribes as a natural stimulant in cases of fatigue and general weakness after an illness. It was an energizing remedy. And Rapondicum is a root. It's a rhizome, thick roots that run parallel. And that's why they're able to spread in large fields. That's why they're not cultivated. They spread naturally with these rhizomes, and you use the rhizome. And there's something to understand about these rhizomes as well. They contain the potential. So all that mineral-rich nutrient, all those micronutrients that are contained within the soil are at some point with the combination of bacteria that is inspired by very specific light that comes from the sun. This is the basics of how a plant grows, of course, but it's unleashed. And that rhizome then has tremendous power. It contains tremendous amounts of, this is the word I was looking for earlier, proanthocyanins, bioflavonoids. Those boost the immune system. That rhizome is powerful. Other plants like hawthornberry is a fruit containing a variety of flavonoids and proanthocyanins again. Hawthornberry, I think its particular benefit, if I'm not mistaken, has an effect on the entire cardiovascular system. So So dilating effects on the blood vessels. Ultimately, the result is a lowering of the blood pressure. So that's a fruit, hawthorn berries.
So you mentioned the soil, and a lot of this, ideally, where do these adaptogens come from? Because, a lot of the soil is not really as healthy as it used to be. So are there specific areas where you're going to get more powerful adaptogens? How do they adapt to our adapting or depleting nutrients in the soil?
Yeah, there are thousands. Yeah, a cultivated soil is generally depleted. With all the disking that occurs and plowing that occurs, no matter how organic you are, and every organic farmer, and I've interviewed many of them, and I was one myself, will tell you that when you break up the soil substrates, when you break the layers of the soil, you're going to disrupt the natural mechanisms. And so by doing so, you're losing a lot of the nutrients. Okay, so yes, you're absolutely correct. It's depletion in cultivated soils. The brilliance of adaptogens is there is not a cultivated soil. Instead, it's a soil that has tremendous number of intact layers of micronutrients, of things, of potentials, thousands of years contained in that soil. And those thousands of years of potential are then slowly, unleashed in essence, as I talked about a minute ago, with sunlight, with bacteria. And then you have the rhizome that's used in some instances. Often it's a fruit, sometimes it's a leaf. But the brilliance of extraction in adaptogens is extraction, of course, because now you're not consuming the cellulose. You're usually and typically with adaptogens consuming the essence, like I am here. This is not my brandy for the morning. It's actually adaptogens. And I love the taste. It's actually delicious.
Was that a blend?
That was a blend. That's a blend. That's a blend. And Mark Premer has done an excellent job in that formulation. I wouldn't be able to list every ingredient off the top of my head, but I think I've listed at least 6. Yeah. Hawthorn berry, rapondicum, Siberian ginseng, schisandra, rhodiola, viburnum. Viburnum is another fruit. Viburnum oculus is another fruit. Stress protective benefits, lots of stress protective benefits. It's similar to the Siberian ginseng again, and high amounts of proanthocyanins. Are you beginning to hear the same words over and over again? I want you to. This is important to understand. There are specific and potential micronutrients coming from adaptogens you cannot get anywhere else, not in the volume and not in the density. And it's very subtle. It's not like I've just had my little shot glass of adaptogens and my hair is standing on end. This is not a miracle in the moment, nor is our body. Our body is a miracle through time. It's a time-honored experience to develop your own healing capacity. You have the innate healing potential living in your physiology in every moment of time. And it's our responsibility to take care of the temple from a biblical point of view. Let's take care of our temple. Let's take care of this physiology. It is important because you are a great contribution to your community. You are greater than you know. Most of us are far greater than we've even yet discovered. So now, why not be the greatest we can be? I just read a book just last night. I read an entire book. It was written by my good friend, Bernadette Gregory. I'll give her a little plug here. It was called It's Never Too Late to Be Great. It's never too late to be great. That's not only from the standpoint of your contribution to your community and your society, but what about yourself? Start with caring for yourself. So back to adaptogens and what they're able to do to contribute to your self-care. It's why I make it a daily discipline. It's why I know things like 90 days is minimum taking something to shift your physiology to a benefit, to an overall benefit. Actually, frankly, with adaptogens, 1 year from now, if you take them every day for 1 year, I will absolutely guarantee that you will feel So much better. I put my license on the line saying that. There's no question about it. It's often reported. Everything is just functioning at a higher level. Think about it. Your gut is healthier. Your cardiovascular system is healthier. Your nervous system is healthier. What happens when all the major systems of the body are now in congruence? They're all harmonizing because the liver is not so stressed that it's robbing energy from the kidneys or from the heart. The kidneys are not so stressed that they're now robbing energy. This is the premise for Dr. Loomis's great work on stress and how to balance the human frame with his chiropractic application, which identifies very specific stressors along and outside that can be felt, that you will feel them as pain. The doctor can feel them by simply exploring and recognizing that, for example, your liver is challenged right now and needs some support. There are ways to identify where energy is being robbed from one organ to another. So adaptogens, again, to emphasize their importance, they balance that biome, that territory. And it's extremely important to consider adaptogens as crucial to a daily discipline, a lifestyle of forever health. I like to say that healing is forever. And right to the day that we transition. And from your timeline, from birth to death, you have a tremendous responsibility to yourself. Mm-hmm. So adaptogens, we talked about vitamin D as much more than just a nutrient. And I lightly touched on superfoods. Now, what are superfoods? Again, it's the same concept as adaptogens, Lynn. It's high density, high volume. If you're not bringing on a daily basis high volume, high density nutrition into your body, you're failing yourself. You really are, because you have a great deal to offer your body. What are some superfoods that are particularly magnificent? Well, I'll give you a few combinations. Rice bran solubles, for example, can strip triglycerides and cholesterol from the liver. Rice bran solubles is a simple product. It's just a process by which they're able to strip that particular benefit from the germ, from outside the germ, the bran. Immune system. We all know about probiotics and enzymes, but we underappreciate them. We need to understand that our microbiome, our gut, requires this input. I'm not saying take probiotics on a daily basis. Generally speaking, you should be taking them fairly often anymore, but you want to do 14-day routines. In some instances, it's 30-day routines. I would suggest you talk with your specific naturopath or your chiropractor, and they can advise you. But your probiotics, your prebiotics, your enzymes are crucial to developing and harmonizing a digestive system that now no longer needs to rob from another system to balance itself. Does that make sense, Lynn?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And superfoods, you get a lot of bang for your buck because they're so nutrient dense, but they're typically very low in calories. So it's,
right.
I just want to ask you something, because you've kind of touched upon it in a few things that you've said, like how I think quite opposite, or my approach. Like, you haven't really stated your philosophy, but we can kind of tell. But can you talk about like your overall philosophy toward health and like your approach when you work with people?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think every physician, I hope, has a philosophy. They have an oath that they take, but they need to develop a philosophy. And I touched on it earlier, a recognition that the power that created us is the power that will heal us, that healing is forever. My philosophy of healing was crucial for establishing my foundation or bedrock of values from which I could then approach my patients or my practice members, whether it was immunity or any other autoimmunity or any other challenge. It was my philosophy that preceded the practice of, I don't like to call it medicine so much, but in this instance, we'll just say it preceded the practice or my therapeutic application. And chiropractic, metabolic support, clinical nutrition as relevant to metabolic support are consistently the approach that I've taken for boosting, not stimulating, but boosting, balancing, and maintaining a healthy immune system that's relevant to this discussion. So again, I think it's crucial to have values as a physician. It's crucial to have a philosophy and to acknowledge the power of the human body, the human physiology, and do everything one can to support it naturally first and most conservatively. And then you have the choice to move from there. But beginning there is really important. And yes, to answer your question directly, I absolutely have a philosophy. I've always had a philosophy. It developed from early on. I described that. And now to this day, I have a philosophy each and every day, actually, about functionality, potentiation inside my own human body. I won't put any, and I won't tell anybody anything or put anything into my body unless I know that it has a particular function. So I know when I consume my rice bran solubles and I combine them with high density green food, which is a gentle detoxer, for example, when I combine those with beets, for example, which have a tremendous capacity to create flexibility in the arteries. Flexibility is a good word to describe it. The arteries can be very inflexible and they become hard. And that's when it begins to create problems in the cardiovascular system. So superfoods do that. As you mentioned, without the calories, they're typically air dried into a powder, and then they can just be rehydrated by putting them into some pure water or a little almond milk like I do. And now you can create your elixir for every morning. I have it right here. I haven't touched it yet because we've been on the call, but it's full of those things we just talked about. And I'll consume 16 ounces of nutrients. Now, but they're all very specific, Lynn. I know why I'm putting them into my body. I know the importance of each of those nutrients, and you can too. It's not difficult. I can send you to some resources if anybody's looking for resources. In fact, I'll leave it there. But yes, all those things. Trailing off here. I'm not wanting to meander too much here. I want to be sure and just answer your questions as directly as possible, but I like to talk.
Well, you are a wealth of information, and we appreciate you being here and sharing with all of our viewers your knowledge on plants, especially adaptogens specifically. So can you tell people where they can find you?
Absolutely. One of the things I want to mention with regard to superfoods as well is I love this idea of 30 meals or 60 meals worth of superfoods that you can consume daily. So if anyone wants to just work with me directly and learn more about that, you can just go to work with Dr. spelled out, Mike, workwithdrmike.com. I'll direct you to some wonderful nutrient value. You can certainly contact me directly, Dr. Mike, DRMIKE, at newpathnutrition.com. There's a few websites that could be helpful as well. If you go to newpathnutrition.info, you'll get a ton of information on superfoods and meals and how we're choosing to distribute superfood meals now. Because I've aligned with a group of people that have direct access to organic farms. There will be no disruption in the food supply chain. You'll get all the protein you need, all the green foods you need, everything that you need to do exactly what we discussed on this call today, which is support yourself and do it effectively, do it functionally. I guess that's it. That's it for now. There's another website, nostress411.com, if you want to learn more about adaptogens. But those are the various ways people can connect with me. Thanks so much for asking, Emily.
Well, thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
It's great fun. It was great fun. I love what you guys are doing. Both of you are really dedicated to making a difference in this world, and I'm actually quite a bit humbled. I'm very pleased to make a contribution, and I know you have lots of other great physicians and healers and people who are contributing to their communities. I'm looking forward to actually watching some of the other videos that you've produced or interviews that you've produced with these people. So thank you so very much. I'm very happy to be part of this project, the Immunity Blueprint Summit.
Thank you.
Thank you.